Welcome to the Dear Nifty mailbag, where we help the industry scale one letter at a time. We're Michelle and Ben from the Nifty team, and this is a video series where we read your letters and dive into the challenges faced by financial advisors and industry professionals. If you want to submit your own letter, click the link in the video description below.
And this week we have a really great letter submitted to us anonymously from a concerned advisor who has a question regarding growing their team in remote work. Dear Nifty, my financial advisory firm is growing and we're considering expanding our team. However, the rise of remote work has me concerned, with most qualified candidates preferring to work from home instead of in our office. How can we maintain our strong culture, ensure seamless collaboration, and protect client confidentiality with remote employees? Any advice would be greatly appreciated. Sincerely, concerned advisor.
Every time I hear an advisor that wants to go remote, but just can't make that leap, it's like sounds so exciting, but also so frustrating at the same time. When we speak to these advisors, typically during prospect calls where they're really interested in having someone remote, just because, of course, when you have a remote team member, just the talent pool opens so greatly. But I feel like the lack of confidence comes from them as a manager, and a lot of the things that they feel like they're gonna miss, working in person typically is like, you know, your your employee sitting in the cubicle next to you, or in the office next to you. You can't just like go over and bother them all of a sudden, or talk about your day so suddenly. Making that connection. You can't ask like, hey, do you want to go out for lunch? Do you want to just go down the road to Chipotle together? um Break rooms, even though I don't even think we had, at my old office, we didn't have like a water cooler. We had like a small cafeteria or a
Yeah,
little room
we
they converted into a cafeteria, um, where every Friday they would have like free bagels and everyone would kind of just consume.
Oh, that's nice. We had a little break room at my old office, but nobody used it. I feel like that ends up being the case for
Really?
businesses.
Or it's just to get coffee, right? That's how they trap you to go into that room.
Yeah, it's like you sneak in, grab your coffee, run out. And I do think a lot of people, especially in today's day and age, like do have a lot of nostalgia for the in-office environment and underestimate the ability to recreate that type of culture in a remote company. I think in addition to, obviously we all work remotely with the advisors we work with, but I think a lot of people don't consider that we are also internally a remote company who's really fostered a really rich culture despite all of us work remotely from each other. So like internally, we've been able to really build a lot of practices to feel like, I don't know, I know at least in my experience, I very much do feel like I'm part of the Nifty team, the Nifty culture, despite the fact that I'm multiple states away from all of my coworkers.
Yeah, and the one question, the king of all questions is, how do I exactly know that my team member is working, especially when you can't see them like at their desk every day? It's kind of crazy, like what heard like other corporations do, where they like track your location. They want to make sure that, your mouse is, they're always online. I don't know how people have the time for that, but a lot of the strategies we're going to share, um, I think covers a lot of the hesitations with firms that are not purely remote. And I think now, like post-COVID versus when I started Nifty, because Nifty we started in 2018, which was a year before COVID started. So nobody was even working remotely at that time. At that time, because remote work wasn't really a thing, I even think now that post COVID, there are so many more tools and applications that have been created to make remote work life so much easier. So there's really I think the best thing about being a manager or leader is just figuring out how to change, something that was really loved in person and finding that application, or how can we get creative to make it like a virtual experience, or how does that translate? And I think that's the best part. So Ben and I came up with a few points that we thought would be extremely beneficial for, or things to consider for advisors that are considering building a remote team. When you're solo is the best time because you don't have to manage a lot of changes. You can start from the ground up. Ben, you want to share the first one?
Yeah, so the first one, which was honestly directly asked within the letter, is that maintaining and prioritization of a culture. I think a lot of people, when they think about remote work, incorrectly do view it as less structured, less collaborative than a in-office environment. And that really, in my experience, is pretty far from the case. I still feel like my days are very structured. I'm interacting constantly with my team, and there is just effort and tools that go into building and fostering that culture, same as there is with an in-person environment. So really what the first thing that I would always prioritize when building out that remote environment is establishing those kind of clear and accessible lines of communication. Naturally in the office, there's a lot of time spent walking over to your coworker's desk, communicating just like in person in the hallway. But also at the end of the day, most formal tasks and most formal communications are still being communicated over email, whether you're in office or not. And so that structure carries over right over to remote work. So what I really do prioritize is finding ways to supplement those additional lines of communication. So the more informal chat, the more, standing around the water cooler type of talk. And to be honest, nowadays, there are so many tools that can do that. We internally use Slack as our resource, which is a great place for, if I have a quick question, no matter how small it is, I can always just shoot my team member a Slack message. They'll get back to me right away. It's the exact same as if I was, not cornering them, running into them in the hallway or going up to their desk. And I think a lot of people also don't really recognize how powerful tools like Slack or Teams are for creating those less work-related conversations that build that sense of community. So we internally, Michelle, you've done a great job of setting up affinity groups, different Slack channels for people who have shared interests, who just want to discuss, their weekend, what they're doing the next week, discuss current events, movies, TV, whatever it may be. We're still having all those same conversations here in Nifty. It just happens to be over a Slack channel as opposed to, in a break room.
Mm-hmm. And similar to, it's really important to create processes for your business and to make sure that the communication channels that you are using have that infrastructure and standard in terms of how to utilize it. So even when you're creating Slack, no, just Slack, the tool itself, it does solve a problem. But when you get really creative and understand not just how you want to utilize the system, but how other people prefer to communicate, and get a good understanding of what their schedule may look like. When Ben was kind of talking about his experience working remotely, there are a lot of individuals where, they are same with an employer moving from in-office to remote for the first time. There are a lot of employees or candidates that were in office or working remotely for the first time. So I've kind of learned that those that are moving from in office where it's a very rigid schedule, they need clear communication in terms of where certain things are. Otherwise, the adjustment to remote work is a bit challenging. Getting creative and building the structure first is definitely key. So in terms of like what the tool is being used for, another thing is just making sure that you are setting expectations in terms of what your own availability looks like and what your expectation for your future team member or existing team member looks like too, and what those response times are. We always communicate that, your CRM should always be the go-to place for that initial delegation or that initial communication. Slack should only be supplemental or for like quick questions for information that doesn't necessarily need to be archived. Because in any organization, there always needs to be a central place where, especially working remotely, where you are readily available, but you also want to make sure that the information you need is where it needs to be. The CRM is always the best place for that. When there is this kind of transition period and, there's been those quite a few advisory firms where they put all the information, whether it's, putting information about a different task, one piece of information in every different system, or it's putting information in the CRM, putting that same information in Slack, putting that same information in email. It's realizing how much time you're wasting when you're not setting expectations about where the communication is supposed to go, what the type of communication is supposed to be, what those response times are. Because once you set those clear expectations and guidelines up front, like really a communication plan within your team, it decreases your anxiety as a manager because you're not wondering where everything is at, especially as I'm sure you as a business owner, where your mind is constantly turned on 24/7. Well, lo and behold, when you do begin to build a team, it gets even worse. So when you that intention, and you communicate it to your team, so it's not just in your, on your system, but you're proactive about setting those guidelines, not just up front, but really training your team around what, if you see communication or different tools not being used properly, being proactive and saying like, hey, I saw you mentioned this important instruction or account number in Slack or Teams. Can you actually put this in the CRM? And just making sure that people are building those communication habits when you are working together. Because I'm sure Ben knows, like, it's not realistic to think that, once you just communicate something once, that it's completely done. It's a habit that has to be built on an ongoing basis because communication is such a huge piece of building an effective remote team.
And honestly, in my opinion, as far as communication goes, I actually view remote work as more of an opportunity than a threat or a weakness for lines of communication. Because when you are working remotely, you're setting up those very clear, well-defined channels of communication. And when it works well, it still feels very seamless. It still feels very incredibly collaborative, incredibly synchronous. But also now, all of a sudden, all of your communication is defined and structured within these channels, communications being archived and captured. So unlike in a working environment within an office where, you may just feel the inclination to delegate work by popping over to someone's desk and verbally saying it, and there's a lot more gray area with communication. In a remote environment, you can set those channels, you can define them, you can communicate on your terms, and it just allows for a lot more clarity when optimized right. There's obviously that learning curve, that process of getting that set up, but once it's up and running, I found honestly my communication with the advisors and the team members that I work with remotely is so much clearer, so much more collaborative because we have those channels defined.
Yeah, and I actually think my saying is that if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And I feel remote work actually pushes you to write more notes, make sure you're writing every single instruction down, which like versus taking instructions through the phone or like over the cubicle desk, those important pieces of information that could easily be overlooked if they aren't captured. So in that aspect where a remote team is trained and they understand the importance of capturing everything in writing, it just makes it very clear in terms of what's been communicated and what hasn't, especially for compliance purposes too. Because most advisors are not, when they have phone conversations, they're not recording it or writing down notes while they're having that phone conversation, or Zoom. But it's important to capture those communication pieces. And I think just having everything in writing just makes it so much easier.
And then honestly, in terms of maintaining that sense of culture and that sense of collaboration, that's also just something that is, that structure doesn't go away once someone goes remote. We still work standardized hours. We still have regular check-in meetings with each other. Even though I work remote, I do spend most of my day talking face to face with team members over Huddle, over Zoom meetings. Like, we're still getting all of that interaction. I still feel deeply connected to the culture, and work remotely allows for you to actually tap into a lot of different tools that are underutilized or not used in an office environment. So for instance, we use Slack internally, like I mentioned, that has so many different add-ons and applications you can build into it with games and with prompts that just keep the conversations going in a really productive and collaborative manner.
Mhm. I know another concern is when working in person, because you're not able to kind of stare at the computer that the employee is actually using. You might have an IT team that's in office, because you can't see it like physically in a remote environment, that client data isn't protected, or you think that a computer may be misused. So in a remote environment, all the important aspects of a cybersecurity and compliance program is still very important. And you'll kind of find, like, even with IT, a lot of IT providers typically work remotely, and they might take a trip over to the office, but a lot of the work, they remote in. I am not IT professional, but they know what's best and I trust them. But there's so many solutions to remote into a desktop from an administrative perspective, and even like with VPNs, um, using antivirus, secure password managers, which was not a thing when I was working in office. Document storage, you don't want to hear about the tax office I worked for, and in the garage there were hundreds and hundreds of filing cabinets. Just like, do we really, like, is that actually safer? Um, so in a lot of different aspects, having the ability to manage an entire cybersecurity program remotely and having it accessible to experts or, IT consultants in the field is probably a good thing. There's a lot of even advisor, cybersecurity like monitoring programs that are available to advisors. So the IT consultant can see everything that's happening on the computer without the advisor having to do any work, and they manage it entirely. They can see, like, when the computer's last software update was, are there any, hopefully not, like viruses, and or all the other programs on the computer up to date. So it's just something to think about. There's a service provider for absolutely everything nowadays. And you know what? They're all working remotely.
Mm-hmm. And honestly, hearing that list that you provided on kind of the cybersecurity practices and tools that we use as a remote practice, these are also, in all transparency, things that even if you're not working remotely, you should have already instilled in your office. Like, in-office environments still need login protection. They still need VPN access. They still need antivirus software. All of these different best practices and tools for cybersecurity, they all translate right from the office directly to working remotely. And so having that accessibility and that transparency, if these are tools you're not currently using, even if you're in office, I'd still strongly consider leveraging them, because, being protected by the four walls of an office is no more secure than being protected by your four walls of your home or your apartment.
Yeah, and even we do have a few firms where they are in office, but they're working remotely with us for the first time. And they are concerned about security. And the one thing that we recommend they do is create a remote environment where the employer or the advisor has literally just a computer, a desktop, or a laptop, a server of some sort sitting in their office, and they set up a remote environment where their remote employee, Nifty team member, whoever it is, can remote into that computer and they still have physical access in case their IT person or in-house systems administrator has to have access to that computer. So there are ways to work around it where if you do want to physically see that computer and be able to manage it, there are options if you're not comfortable with a team member just managing a computer entirely on their own. They can remote in instead.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um,
And so I think really with all this, there are all these tools, all these avenues to really recreate that culture, recreate that security, and have a really streamlined experience working with a virtual employee. To be honest, same thing with onboarding a new employee who happens to be working in your office. It's really just comes down to planning, having a really solid onboarding practice and procedure, having those trainings in place, and getting that team member, up to speed and comfortable with working remotely while still being a part of that team and a part of that collaborative environment.
mhm. um, there are so many things that advisors should consider before even um, planning training. So when you plan any type of training or development program, we really have to assess like where the candidate is or the new hire is in that certain point in time. And a couple tools that we use where you can always conduct like a personality assessment. There's like Colby, DISC, Myers-Briggs, whichever you prefer. I know some employers or companies prefer other personality tests than others. You can also do an experience assessment, so looking at the tech stack that the new hire is already familiar with, their soft skills and their uh, technical skills, like in terms of the role itself, figuring out what their current experience is and what your expectations are in the role. So you can identify the gaps with a gap analysis and really make sure that your training plan is intentional, understanding like how they prefer to learn or how they perceive information. Do they prefer to attack a new task or a new piece of technology first and then come to you? Or do they prefer to maybe discuss and get a briefing before they kind of jump into a system or a new process? Do they prefer video recording? Do they prefer having screenshots, instructions, and writing? Do they like messing up first, like having a demo environment and then learning from there? Do they like having a mentor? Like there're just so many different ways and all of us learn very differently. So in the same way where, we always recommend that you ask your client like their communication preferences, like what their expectations are. In the same way you would ask your remote employees. So again, you're not wasting precious time, especially because working remotely, there's kind of this ambig ambiguity. We cannot talk today. Yes, between like understanding, what their needs are and what our needs are,
Mm.
or the company's needs are. So it just makes it a lot more clear, and then you can plan out the training based on what the candidate's needs are.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And so really, from both our experience working with advisors as well as my time working prior to joining Nifty in an office, which during the pandemic then became kind of a hybrid situation, some of us in office, some of us not. These tools and these practices are super applicable both for remote work and in office work, as well as if you are an existing advisor with an existing team who is in office and you want to consider expanding out and bringing in remote workers into that environment. These tools exist, these practices that exist that with a little bit of discipline and planning, you can really integrate a new team member seamlessly who happens to be working, let's say it's all the way across the country, to your team that's already in office. And I think that the major benefit of that is it just expands your net so wide to find people who have the skill sets, the personality to be a perfect fit for your team without the limitations of them being within a certain mile radius of you. And I think that upside is just invaluable.
Yeah, I believe that nothing can replace remote work, but it does require a lot more intention when you're building out the infrastructure and the culture. It does require a lot more creativity, where I say, when you have an in-office team, people always say that the culture kind of evolves naturally. That's not the case with remote work, and financial services is probably one of the most driest industries out there. So advisors might have a little bit more of a challenge to figure out, get a little creative with the tools that they currently have. So I think that's the most fun thing, is figuring out, how can we recreate in-person experiences to make the employee experience at Nifty the best remote experience that our team has ever had, and for advisors as well. So we're going to leave it at that. I think this is a really great conversation. I really hope this advisor makes the leap, even if it's just a part-time hire. These are probably one of my most favorite questions, because unfortunately a lot of corporations are going back in office, but that's not our problem. We're striving to be the best in remote work. And if you're interested in submitting a Nifty letter, if you have a concern like this or anything else that may be looming, definitely submit using the link below. And we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Ben, and we'll see you all soon.
Thank you, Michelle. Bye, everyone.